The air in Rogaland was thick with salt and ambition in the spring of 868 AD. Flóki Vilgerðarson stood on the shore, a man driven by stories. He had heard tales of a great island in the north, a place called Gardarsholmi, found by a Swede named Gunnar Svavarson. Flóki was not a man to let another's discovery lie unclaimed. He was a Viking of great renown, a descendant of kings, and he would find this land for himself. He gathered his family, his livestock, and a crew of men who trusted his name more than they trusted the sea. They called him Rafna Flóki, Raven Flóki, and the reason for that name was caged on the deck of his longship. 3 black ravens sat in a wooden cage. They were his secret weapon, his connection to the old ways, and the wisdom of the gods. He had performed a great sacrifice, a blot, to bless them and his journey. He believed Odin's eyes would fly for him. The ship set sail from western Norway, its single square sail catching the wind. They passed the Shetland Islands, a familiar stop for Norse sailors. They resupplied and then pushed off into the unknown. For days the world was nothing but gray water and gray sky. The crew grew restless. The sun was a rare guest, and the horizon was an empty circle. Well, there were no landmarks, no familiar currents, just the endless rolling of the North Atlantic. Flóki waited. He felt the ship's rhythm, the way it climbed each swell and slid down its back. He watched the sky for any sign. But the ocean offered no clues. After several days, when the men's hope was beginning to fray, he went to the cage. He opened the door and took out the first raven. He held it for a moment, then tossed it into the air. The bird circled the mast 3 times, its black wings stark against the low clouds. Then, without hesitation, it turned and flew directly back the way they had come, toward Shetland, toward the safety of known land. A murmur went through the crew. The raven knew where home was. But Flóki was not going home. A day or 2 later, he took the second raven. This one he also threw into the air. The bird flew high, climbing in wide circles above the ship. It saw only the same endless water its human companions saw. After a few minutes of searching the empty horizon, it flew back down and landed on the rigging, its head cocked, as if waiting for a better idea. It had found no land, but it had not fled. This told Flóki they were far from any shore, truly in the void between worlds. More time passed. The food was monotonous, the water stale. The cold was a constant ache in their bones. Doubt was a quiet passenger on the ship. Then Flóki took the third and final raven. He lifted it from the cage. This time, when he threw it into the air, the bird behaved differently. It gained height, circled once, and then set a determined course, flying straight ahead to the northwest. It did not look back, it did not land, it flew with purpose toward something beyond the horizon, something only it could sense. Flóki pointed. He yelled to the steersman, "Follow that bird." The rudder was turned, the sail was trimmed. The ship changed course, chasing a black speck that was quickly swallowed by the gray distance. They sailed on that bearing for the rest of the day and into the next. The crew's mood shifted. The raven had shown them a path. Hope returned, and then they saw it. Not land itself, but the signs of it. A different kind of seabird, a change in the water's color, and finally a faint dark line on the horizon. It was the vast, empty coast of the land. He would later, in a fit of disappointment after a harsh winter, name Iceland. Rafna Flóki had found his island, not with a map, not with a compass, but with the ancient knowledge that a bird released far from shore will always fly toward the nearest land. Number 17. The bird knows the way when the man does not. In the year 872, a man named Ottar from Hålogaland in northern Norway decided to test the limits of his world. He was a wealthy man, a trader in furs and walrus ivory, but he was also curious. He wanted to know what lay to the north, beyond the lands of the Norsemen. He told his story later to King Alfred the Great of Wessex, and a scribe wrote it down. Ottar did not have a map. He did not have what we would call navigational instruments. What he had was his ship, his crew, and a lifetime of observing the world around him. He sailed north, keeping the coast on his starboard side. For days, the land was all he knew. Then he sailed east and then south, circumnavigating the Scandinavian peninsula. On these long coastal voyages, a primary concern was finding safe harbor, especially when fog rolled in or a storm threatened. On a particularly grim afternoon, with a thick sea mist reducing visibility to a few ship lengths, Ottar's steersman, a stoic man named Kveld, was worried. They were near a treacherous stretch of coast, full of hidden rocks and small islands. To be caught there in the fog was a death sentence. The crew was silent, listening to the water slap against the hull. There was no sun, no horizon, no land to guide them. Kveld did something that looked like magic to a younger sailor on board. He went to a small cage near the stern. Inside were several common guillemots, seabirds they had caught earlier. He took one out, he tied a small, brightly colored strip of cloth to its leg, and released it. The bird, disoriented for a moment, circled the ship. Then it seemed to get its bearings and flew low over the water, heading directly into the fog. Kveld watched it disappear. He said nothing. He simply held the ship on a steady course. About an hour later, a man at the bow shouted. The bird was back. It was flying toward them from out of the mist. But it was not alone. Following it was a whole flock of guillemots. Kveld grunted. Land is that way, he said, pointing in the direction the flock had come from. They are returning to their nesting cliffs for the evening. He knew that different birds had different habits. Terns and gulls might wander far out to sea during the day, but auks, puffins, and guillemots stayed closer to their homes. A large flock returning in a straight line late in the day was as good as a map. It pointed directly to the nearest cliff face. And Ottar ordered the ship to follow the bird's path at a slow, cautious pace. Within 2 hours, the dark, towering shape of a cliff emerged from the fog. They had found their landmark. They knew this cliff. From there, they could navigate to a sheltered cove they had used before. The simple observation of a bird's daily routine had saved them from wrecking their ship on a blind coast. They did not just see birds, they read them. They knew their flight patterns, their feeding ranges, and their nesting habits. A fulmar might mean you were still in deep ocean water. A gannet diving for fish suggested you were over a productive bank, often not far from shore. And a flock of guillemots heading home at dusk was a living compass pointing to the nearest safe place. Number 16. The sun can be found even when it is hidden. Leif Erikson stood on the deck of his Nar, a sturdy trading vessel far from the coast of Greenland. The year was 1001. He was sailing west, following the rumor-laced tales of Bjorn Iron-Jaw, who had been blown off course years earlier and sighted new lands. For 3 days, the sky had been a blanket of solid gray. The sun, their only reliable guide in the open ocean, was gone. The wind was steady from the east, which was helpful, but without the sun to check their heading, they could be drifting far to the north or south. A sense of unease settled over the 35 men on board. To be lost in the North Atlantic was to be consigned to a cold, watery grave. Leif did not seem concerned. He called for a small wooden box to be brought from his cabin. Inside, resting on a piece of sheepskin, was a clear, rectangular crystal. It was an Iceland spar, a form of calcite. The crew called it a solarstein, a sunstone. It looked like a piece of ice, but it held a strange property. Leif took the stone and held it up toward the brightest part of the sky. The crew watched, some with skepticism, some with a desperate hope. The sun was completely obscured by a thick layer of clouds. There was no visible disk, no bright spot, just a uniform, depressing gray. Leif slowly rotated the crystal, looking through it at the sky. He was not looking for an image of the sun. He was looking for a subtle change in the light passing through the stone. As he turned it, he saw 2 faint, shadowy bands appear inside the crystal. They looked like a dim hourglass. He kept turning the stone until these 2 shadows were equally dark. When they were perfectly balanced, he stopped. He pointed along the axis of the crystal. "The sun is there," he said calmly. He had found the sun's position. The science was unknown to him, but the effect was reliable. Sunlight, when it scatters through the atmosphere, becomes polarized. This means the light waves tend to vibrate in a specific direction relative to the sun. The Iceland spar is a birefringent crystal, meaning it splits light into two rays. When polarized light passes through it, the stone can reveal the direction of that polarization. By finding the direction of the polarized light in the sky, even on a cloudy day, a skilled user could locate the hidden sun with surprising accuracy. It was a simple tool, a piece of rock, but it gave the Vikings a compass when all other signs failed. With the sun's position confirmed, Leif could consult his other tools. He could use a sun compass, a simple wooden disc with a central gnomon, to cast a shadow and confirm his latitude and bearing. He had his guide back, the crew's confidence returned, they were no longer sailing blind. They were on Leif Erikson's course again, a course that would lead them to a new world they would call Vinland. The sunstone was not magic, it was a secret born of careful observation and the use of a natural resource to solve a deadly problem. Number 15, the ocean writes its own story in the waves. The voyage from Kaupang in Norway to Jorvik in England was a well-traveled route by 950 AD, but well-traveled did not mean safe. A Viking trader named Gunnar was making the crossing with a cargo of soapstone bowls and reindeer antlers. He was a veteran of the North Sea, a man whose face was a map of wind and sun. For 2 days the weather had been perfect. A steady wind filled their sail, and the sea was calm, with only small, choppy waves born of the local breeze. The sky was clear. Everything pointed to an easy passage. Gunnar, however, was not at ease. He stood at the stern, his hand on the steering oar, not watching the sail or the sky, but the water itself. He ignored the small, wind-driven waves. He was feeling something else, something deeper. A long, low, almost invisible swell was rolling under the ship from the northwest. The waves were so far apart that the ship would rise slowly, hang for a moment on a crest of water so wide it felt like a hill, and then sink just as slowly into the trough. A younger sailor would not have even noticed it. It had no whitecaps, it made no noise, it was the ghost of a wave. "There's a storm behind us," Gunnar said to his second-in-command, a young man named Halfdan. Halfdan looked at the clear sky. The weather is good." Gunnar shook his head. "The wind waves are from the east with us. But the swell, the old wave, is from the northwest. A big storm, maybe a day's sail away, made that swell, and it will be here by tomorrow morning." Gunnar understood a fundamental truth of the ocean. There are two kinds of waves. There are the local waves, created by the wind blowing at that moment. They are steep, choppy, and confused. And then there is the swell or ground swell. These are waves created by the immense power of a distant storm system. They travel for hundreds, even thousands of miles across the open ocean, losing their steepness but not their energy. They are the pulse of the ocean, a message from a storm happening over the horizon. A skilled navigator like Gunnar could read the swell like a book. Its direction told him where the storm was. Its period, the time between crests, told him about the storm's intensity. A long period, like the one he was feeling, meant a powerful, well-organized storm. A short period meant a weaker local disturbance. The swell was also a fantastic navigational aid. In fog or under cloudy skies, when the sun was gone, this constant, unwavering direction from the northwest was a reliable line to steer by. And it was a compass provided by the ocean itself. Halfdan was skeptical, but he respected Gunnar. They prepared the ship. They secured the cargo, they double-checked the rigging. The next morning, the sky was still clear, but the swell from the northwest was higher, more noticeable. By midday, the first high, thin clouds, the messengers of a weather front, began to appear on the northwestern horizon. By late afternoon, the wind had died, the sky had turned a sickly yellow-gray, and the sea had taken on an oily, ominous calm. And then the storm hit. The wind screamed from the northwest, and the sea erupted. But they were ready for it. And Gunnar's ability to read the deep, silent story of the ocean swell had given them a 12-hour warning that no clear sky could provide. Number 14. The whales know the currents. In the early 10th century, a voyage from Iceland to the new settlements in Greenland was one of the most dangerous undertakings in the Norse world. The route crossed the notoriously violent Denmark Strait, a place of icebergs, sudden storms, and disorienting fog. A shipmaster named Bjorn Iron-Jaw was attempting the crossing for the first time. He had a saga man's description of the route, which was little more than sail west from the Snæfellsnes Peninsula for 2 days, then turn a little north. It was a terrifyingly vague instruction. After 2 days of sailing west, Bjorn and his crew were in the open ocean. Iceland was gone behind them, and there was no sign of Greenland ahead. A thick fog had descended, and a cold that felt different, a deep and biting cold, had settled in. They were drifting. Fear, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to creep into the men's hearts. They could be sailing in circles. They could be heading into the empty expanse of the Labrador Sea. Bjorn, however, had been taught by his father to look for the Ronraid, the whale road. It was a poetic term from the old skalds, but it was based on a practical reality. On the third morning, a lookout shouted. He was pointing not at land, but at a series of misty plumes rising from the sea. A pod of fin whales was moving slowly but steadily through the water, heading southwest. Bjorn felt a surge of relief. He ordered the ship to alter course and follow them. An older sailor explained to a nervous boy on his first voyage. The whales are not wandering, they are migrating. They follow the food. The whales were on a very specific path. They were following the edge of the cold East Greenland current, which flows south along the Greenlandic coast. This current is rich in krill and small fish, the whale's primary food source. By following the feeding whales, the Vikings were essentially following a major ocean current. This was a form of navigation. It kept them on a known track. This whale road did more than just point the way. The presence of these specific types of large whales indicated the water temperature and type. Fin whales and humpbacks preferred these cold, nutrient-rich waters. Seeing them meant they were in the correct current system. If they had seen different species or no whales at all, it might have meant they had drifted too far south into the warmer waters of the Irminger Current. The water itself was a clue. Bjorn would periodically have a bucket of water hauled on deck. He'd feel it. The intense, biting cold of the water confirmed they were in the East Greenland Current. The presence of icebergs, which they began to see later that day, was another sign. These bergs were carried south by the same current. The whales, the water temperature, and the ice were all connected parts of the same puzzle. By following the living signposts of the whales, Bjorn was able to stay on course. 2 days later, the fog lifted to reveal the towering, ice-capped mountains of Greenland's eastern coast. The whale road had led them home. Number 13, the land has a breath you can smell. Ketil Flatnose was an old man by Viking standards when he fled Norway from the tyranny of Harald Finehair around the year 890. He and his family set out to find a new home in the west. They sailed for the Hebrides off the coast of Scotland. After many days at sea, with supplies running low and the crew's morale sinking, finding land became a desperate need. The weather was damp and misty, and visibility was poor. They had been sailing on a rough heading, but they had no real idea of their exact position. One morning, Ketil came on deck and stood at the prow, his head raised, sniffing the air like an old hound. The wind was coming from the west, the direction they believed land to be. The air was still cold and tasted of salt, as it always did at sea. But Ketil detected something else. A faint, almost imperceptible scent was mixed in with the sea spray. It was the smell of damp earth, of wet vegetation, of wood smoke that wasn't from their own ship's cooking fire. "I smell Scotland," he declared. The crew looked at him, then looked out at the empty gray sea. They saw nothing. They smelled only salt. But Ketil was insistent. He had spent his life living by the coast. He knew the clean, sterile smell of the open ocean. And he knew the complex, living smell of land. It was a scent carried on the wind, a land breath. This scent changed with the seasons and the weather. After a heavy rain, the smell of wet soil and plants would be stronger and could carry for many miles out to sea. The smell of burning peat from a coastal settlement was an unmistakable sign of human habitation. In the spring, the scent of blooming gorse or heather could be a fragrant beacon. Ketil knew that a steady onshore breeze, after a day of rain, was the best condition for smelling land from a distance. The wind picks up the volatile organic compounds released by soil, trees, and decaying plants, and carries them out over the water. To a modern person accustomed to the smells of a city, it would be unnoticeable. But to a Viking, whose senses were keenly attuned to the natural world, it was as clear as a shout. He ordered the ship to hold its course, sailing directly into the wind. For hours there was still nothing to see. Some of the men began to mutter that the old man was losing his mind, but Kettle remained confident. The smell was getting stronger. He could now distinguish the scent of pine from the damp, mossy smell of the earth. Then, a lookout high on the mast yelled. He had seen it. A break in the low-lying mist revealed the dark, rugged coastline of an island. Kettil had navigated them to shore with his nose. This sensory navigation was a crucial skill. It was imprecise, but in the final, critical stage of a voyage, when you were close but still blind, the breath of the land could be the one thing that guided you to a safe harbor instead of a rocky reef. Number 12, clouds reflect the world below. Around the year 985, Eric the Red was leading a fleet of 25 ships from Iceland to his new colony in Greenland. It was a massive undertaking, a migration of families and livestock across a treacherous stretch of ocean. On this journey, one of the greatest dangers was not the open sea, but the approach to land. The coast of Greenland is a fortress of ice and rock, often shrouded in fog, and floating in the sea around it are countless icebergs, some as big as hills. Hitting one could tear the bottom out of a ship. On a ship captained by a man named Herjolf, the lookout was not just scanning the horizon for land, he was scanning the sky. The day was overcast, with a low, uniform cloud ceiling. The sea was gray, the sky was gray, and the world was without color or feature. But the lookout was searching for a specific sign in the clouds, and then he saw it. Far to the northwest, the underside of the clouds had a distinct, pale, yellowish, white glare. It was a soft but noticeable glow against the dull gray. He shouted down to Herjolf. Ice blinked to the northwest. Herjolf immediately came to see. He knew exactly what this meant. The phenomenon was called Jara Lejos, or ice light. Sea ice, and the massive ice sheets covering Greenland are highly reflective. On an overcast day, this vast white surface reflects sunlight up onto the base of the clouds. This creates a bright luminous patch, the ice blink, which is visible long before the ice itself can be seen over the horizon. It was an early warning system. It told them the direction of the main ice pack. But there were other signs in the sky as well. To the west, the cloud base seemed darker, almost bruised. This was a water sky. Open water, being dark, absorbs light and does not reflect it. This makes the clouds above it appear dark in comparison to clouds over ice or snow. By reading the patterns of light and dark on the cloud ceiling, a skilled Viking navigator could create a rough map of the seascape ahead of him, even when it was completely hidden from view. A bright ice blink meant a large field of sea ice. A dark water sky meant an open channel, a safe passage. A mottled pattern could indicate a scattering of smaller icebergs. Herjolf used this information to adjust their course. He steered away from the brightest part of the ice blink, aiming for a patch of darker clouds that suggested a clear channel leading toward the coast. This ability to read the sky map was not just for finding land, it was a matter of survival. It allowed them to navigate the deadly maze of sea ice that guarded the entrance to the Greenland settlements. Of Eric the Red's 25 ships, only 14 completed the journey. The others were lost to storms or crushed by ice. Herjolf's ship made it. His survival and the survival of his family depended not just on the strength of his ship, but on his ability to see the reflection of a hidden world in the clouds. Number 11. The temperature of the water tells a story. Thorfinn Karlsefni was an ambitious Icelandic merchant. Around 1010 AD, he led a major expedition to Vinland, the land Leif Erikson had discovered in North America. With 3 ships and about 160 settlers, he intended to establish a permanent colony. His voyage was one of the most well-documented of the Viking Age. Navigating the unfamiliar waters of the North American coast was a huge challenge. They were off the map, sailing along a coastline no European had ever charted. One of the subtle but critical techniques Thorfinn's navigator, a man named Snorri, used was to constantly monitor the water. As they sailed south from what was likely Labrador, Snorri would frequently order a wooden bucket to be dropped over the side on a rope. He was not checking for freshness, he was checking for temperature and color. In the open Atlantic, the water was a deep dark blue and bitingly cold. But as they neared the coast and sailed south, things began to change. One afternoon, Snorri plunged his hand into a freshly drawn bucket of seawater. He grunted in surprise. "It's warmer," he said. The change was slight, but unmistakable. He also held a glass jar of the water up to the light. It was no longer the clear, deep blue of the ocean. It had a greenish tinge and was slightly cloudy with sediment. He knew what this meant. They were entering a different body of water, a different current system. They were likely near the mouth of a very large river. The warmer, greener, sediment-filled water was fresh water from a massive river mixing with the cold, salty ocean water. This was a major navigational clue. A huge outflow of fresh water meant a significant river system, which in turn meant a large landmass, fertile valleys, and a potential site for a settlement. They followed this subtle trail of warmer, greener water. It led them into what historians believe was the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a vast inland sea fed by the St. Lawrence River. The change in water was their guide. The Vikings had a deep understanding of ocean currents like the Gulf Stream, which they would have encountered on voyages further south, and the colder currents of the north. They knew that these currents were like rivers within the ocean, each with its own characteristic temperature, color, and salinity. Snorri could even taste the water. A quick taste could tell him if the salinity was dropping, another sure sign that they were nearing a source of fresh water, whether it was a river or melting sea ice. By using his senses touch, sight, taste, he was performing a basic form of oceanography. He was reading the water's properties to understand the unseen landscape around him. The simple act of dropping a bucket over the side gave him crucial information that helped guide the expedition to a sheltered spot where they established a temporary settlement, a place they called Hop. It was a place of wild grapes, salmon-filled rivers, and timber, a promise of a new life found by following the whispers of the water. Number 10. The sound of the sea is not one voice, but many. A small fleet of 3 longships left the trading town of Birka in Sweden in the year 880. They were on a raiding expedition heading east across the Baltic Sea toward the lands of the Curonians in modern-day Latvia. The leader was a fierce but cautious chieftain named Rorik. The Baltic is a shallow, treacherous sea filled with islands and shoals. Fog is a constant companion. On the 3rd night of their voyage, a dense, wet fog rolled in, blanketing the sea in silence and darkness. They were sailing blind, the ship slowed, the men rowing cautiously. The only sounds were the rhythmic splash of the oars, the creak of the oarlocks, and the dripping of condensation from the rigging. Rorik stood at the steering oar of the lead ship. He was not looking. He was listening. To an untrained ear, the sea sounds like a constant, meaningless noise. But Rorik could hear a symphony of information. He could distinguish the soft slap of small waves against the hull, which told him the wind was light. He could hear the deeper gurgle of the water moving along the keel, which gave him a sense of their speed. But he was listening for something else. He had assigned a man with keen hearing to lie down on the deck, with his ear pressed against the wooden planks of the hull. The ship itself acted as a giant soundboard, picking up and amplifying noises traveling through the water. After about an hour of tense silence, the listening man sat up. "I hear it," he whispered. "Breakers, to the left." Rorik listened intently. Now he could hear it too. It was not the sound of waves hitting the ship. It was a low, distant, rhythmic growl. Hell, it was the sound of waves crashing on a shore or a hidden reef. This was echo navigation in its most basic form. The sound told them 2 things, the direction of the danger and a rough idea of its character. A steady, deep roar meant a long, sandy beach. A sharper, more violent, crashing sound with pauses in between suggested a rocky coastline or a reef where waves would swell up and crash down with great force. Rorik ordered the steersman to turn the ship to starboard, away from the sound. They continued on, listening. Later, the sound changed. It became a strange, confused, splashing sound. Rorik recognized it. It was the sound of a roost or race, a place where two opposing currents met, creating a chaotic, churning sea. These tide rips were often found at the tips of headlands or between islands. They were dangerous to navigate, but they were also a landmark. Rorik knew of a large tide race off the coast of Courland. By identifying this specific sound, he could pinpoint his position on his mental map of the Baltic. He was using a sound chart. The Vikings understood that every part of the sea had its own voice. The way a wave echoed off a tall cliff was different from how it sounded against a low-lying island. By learning these acoustic signatures, a navigator could see the coastline in the dark or in thick fog, guided by nothing more than the many voices of the sea. Number 9. The direction of the wind is written in the water. Harald Bluetooth, King of Denmark, commissioned a great series of circular forts or trelleborgs in the late 10th century. These were military strongholds, and to supply and man them, ships were constantly moving along the coasts and through the narrow, winding channels of the Danish archipelago. A young helmsman named Styrbjorn was in charge of a small cargo vessel, a birding, carrying timber to the Fyrkat fortress. His route took him through the complex waterways of the Limfjord. The challenge in these fjords was not the open sea, but the constantly shifting winds. The wind would be blocked by a hill, then funneled down a valley, then swirled around by a cliff. Watching the sail was not enough. The wind at mast height could be doing something completely different from the wind at the surface of the water. Styrbjorn spent almost no time looking up at his sail. He spent his time looking down at the water ahead of the ship. He was reading the Vindgar, the wind lanes. On a seemingly calm day, he could see long, dark patches on the surface of the water. These were areas where a puff of wind, a cat's paw, was touching down and ruffling the surface. The dark patch would move across the water, showing him exactly where the wind was and where it was going. Or he could steer his ship to intercept these patches of wind, catching a gust that would push him past a difficult point. He was essentially connecting the dots, sailing from one patch of wind to the next. Conversely, he could see the calm spots, too. These glassy patches where, the water was like a mirror told him where the wind was absent, where he would lose momentum and be forced to use the oars. By reading these patterns, he could chart a course through a maze of shifting breezes, using the energy of the wind with maximum efficiency. This technique became even more important in stronger winds. He could see an approaching squall long before it hit the ship by watching the water a quarter-mile ahead. A dark, violent-looking line would rush across the surface, churning the water white. This was the gust front. Seeing it gave him precious seconds to warn the crew to brace themselves or to reef the sail before the full force of the wind struck. It was a visual early warning system. Styrbjorn was not just a sailor, he was a micrometeorologist. He understood that the surface of the water was a high-resolution map of the wind. The color, texture, and movement of the water's surface told him everything he needed to know. Dark, ruffled patches meant wind. Glassy slicks meant calm. Streaks of foam, called windrows, showed the sustained direction of a strong wind. By reading these signs, he could anticipate the wind's every move, making him a faster and safer sailor than one who only looked at his own sail. He was not just reacting to the wind, he was in a conversation with it, and the water was their shared language. Number 8. A simple piece of wood can map the sun's journey. By 900 AD, the voyages between Norway and Iceland were common. The journey was long, and staying on the correct latitude was the key to success. If you sailed too far south, you'd miss Iceland entirely and end up in the empty ocean. If you sailed too far north, you'd run into the sea ice. The challenge was to sail due west. But how do you do that when a magnetic compass was not yet in use in Europe? A farmer and part-time trader named Thorolf was making the crossing. He had a tool that was both incredibly simple and profoundly effective. It was a Solskugafjol, a sun shadow board. It was nothing more than a small wooden disc floating in a bucket of water to keep it level. In the center of the disc was a small vertical pin, a gnomon. As the sun moved across the sky, the pin's shadow would move across the disc. In the morning, shortly after sunrise, Thorolf marked the tip of the shadow on the disc with a peg. He did the same at various points throughout the morning. The pegs formed a curve. He knew that the shortest shadow of the day would occur at local noon when the sun was at its highest point in the sky. At this moment, the sun is due south in the northern hemisphere. The shadow cast by the pin would point directly north. By watching the shadow shorten as it approached the center of the disk and then begin to lengthen again as it moved away, he could determine the moment of noon with great accuracy. He would draw a line from the center pin through the mark of the shortest shadow. This line was his north-south axis. Once he had that, he could easily determine east and west. This allowed him to check his course and correct for any drift caused by winds or currents. But the sun shadow board did more. It helped him maintain his latitude. Before he left his home port in Bergen, Norway, Thorolf had made a special mark on his board. At noon on the day of departure, he had measured the length of the gnomon's shadow and carved a circle on the disk at that distance from the center. This circle represented the sun's noon height at the latitude of Bergen. To get to Iceland, which is at a similar latitude, he just had to make sure that at noon each day, the shadow of his pin touched that same carved circle. If the noon shadow was shorter, not reaching the circle, it meant the sun was higher in the sky. This told him he had drifted too far south. He needed to steer north. If the noon shadow was longer extending past the circle, it meant the sun was lower. He had drifted too far north, he needed to steer south. This simple device, a piece of wood in a bucket, allowed him to perform the two fundamental tasks of open ocean navigation, determining direction and maintaining latitude. It was a portable sundial and a basic sextant combined, a testament to the elegant, practical solutions the Vikings devised to conquer the ocean. Number 7. The color of the ice speaks of its danger. In the settlements of Greenland, ice was not a feature of winter, it was a constant defining feature of life. A Greenlander Norseman named Orm, living in the western settlement around 1150, was a hunter. He spent his summers hunting seals and walrus along the coast in a small, skin-covered boat. His survival depended on his ability to read the ice. To him, ice was not just one thing. It had 100 different names and 100 different meanings. One clear, cold morning, Orm was paddling through a channel filled with floating ice. He was looking for a path through the maze. He ignored the bright white, snow-covered icebergs. They were old, their snowy tops indicating they had been floating for a long time. They were dangerous but predictable. He was looking at the color of the ice itself. He saw a large, rounded piece of ice that was a startlingly deep blue color. He immediately paddled away from it. Blue ice, he knew, was old, compressed glacial ice. It was incredibly dense and hard as rock. A collision with a piece of blue ice, even a small one, could split a wooden ship's hull. It was also a sign of instability. Old icebergs are often top-heavy and can roll over without warning, crushing anything nearby. Further on, he saw a piece of ice that was greenish-black. This was even more dangerous. He called it black ice, though it was not the same as the black ice on a road. This was an iceberg that had recently calved from a glacier and flipped over. The dark color came from the rock and soil it had scraped from the land as the glacier moved. Its darkness meant it was very hard to see in the water, and its recent flip meant it was highly unstable. It was a hidden killer. The safest ice was the young sea ice. It was grayish and opaque. It was softer and more brittle. A ship could often push through it. Orm knew how to read the patterns of its formation and breakup. He knew where the currents and winds would pile it up and where they would open leads of clear water. This intimate knowledge of ice was not just for hunters in small boats. It was essential for any ship trying to reach the Greenland settlements. The sagas speak of ships being beset by ice, trapped for weeks or months in the frozen sea. A captain who could not distinguish between the dangerous old blue glacial ice and the more manageable gray sea ice was risking his ship and the lives of everyone on board. The color of the ice told a story of its age, its density, and its stability. To the Norse Greenlanders, reading these colors was as important as reading the weather in the sky. It was a specialized language of survival learned over generations of living at the edge of the world. Number 6. The stars are a fixed map in a moving world. The voyage was a failure. In 986, a merchant named Bjorn Iron-Jaw set sail from Iceland to join his father in the new colony in Greenland. He was a capable sailor, but he was sailing into the unknown. A storm hit. For days, his ship was driven by fierce northeasterly winds under a sky thick with clouds. He was lost. When the weather finally cleared, he had no idea where he was. The sun gave him his cardinal directions, but it did not tell him his latitude. For that, he needed the night sky. Bjarni was not an astronomer, but like all Norse sailors, he knew Polaris, the North Star. He called it the Leiderstjerne, the leading star. It was the one fixed point in the heavens, the nail around which the entire sky turned. The height of this star above the horizon was a direct measure of your latitude. The further north you go, the higher Polaris appears in the sky. The further south, the lower it sinks toward the horizon. That night, Bjarni waited for darkness. As the stars emerged, he found the familiar shape of the Big Dipper, what he called Karlsvang, or Charles's Wain. He used the two stars at the end of the Dipper's bowl to point directly to Polaris. Then he used a simple but effective method to measure its height. He held his hand out at arm's length. He knew from experience that his clenched fist, held upright, covered a certain amount of the sky. He measured the distance from the horizon to Polaris in fists or fingers. He knew the height of Polaris in Greenland from his father's descriptions. Looking at the sky now, he saw that Polaris was lower than it should be. It was significantly lower. He had been blown far to the south of Greenland. This one simple observation gave him his most crucial piece of information. He was not just lost, he was in the wrong part of the world. He turned his ship northeast, sailing with the leading star off his port bow, trying to raise it higher in the sky each night. After several days, he sighted land. But the land was low and forested, not the mountainous, glacier-covered land of Greenland he had been told to expect. He knew he was still too far south. He did not go ashore. He continued sailing north, keeping the coast to his left. He sighted land 2 more times, each time more mountainous than the last, but still not the Greenland he knew. Each night he checked Polaris, it was rising, he was correcting his latitude. Finally, after many days, he saw the familiar ice-capped mountains of Greenland. He had found his destination. Bjarni Herjolfsson had accidentally become the first European to sight North America. He did not explore it because he was a practical merchant, not an explorer. His goal was Greenland, but his journey demonstrates the power of celestial navigation. Without a single chart or instrument beyond his own hands and eyes, he was able to determine he was lost, figure out in which direction his error lay, and systematically correct it by using the unmoving North Star as his guide. The stars were the Vikings' ultimate map, a reliable grid laid over a chaotic world. Number 5. Every coast has its own rhythm of tides. In 991, a large Viking fleet sailed up the Blackwater estuary in Essex, England. Their goal was to raid the rich lands of the Anglo-Saxons. They landed on North Island, a small piece of land connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway at low tide. The English forces led by the Ealdorman Bertnoth gathered on the opposite side of the causeway. The tide was coming in. The causeway was flooding. The battle could not begin. The Vikings, led by a man history remembers only as a Viking, possibly Olaf Tryggvason, waited. The Viking leader was not just waiting for the water to recede, he was observing. He was an experienced coastal raider. He understood that tides were not just a simple rising and falling of the sea. Every estuary, every bay, every river mouth had its own unique tidal rhythm. He watched the speed of the incoming current. He noted the markers on the shore rocks, posts, patches of seaweed, and saw how quickly they were being covered. He was calculating the tidal range and the timing. He knew that the ebb tide, the outgoing tide, is often faster and more powerful in a narrow estuary than the flood tide. The entire volume of water in the estuary has to drain out through a narrow mouth, creating a powerful current. This piece of knowledge was a tactical weapon. The famous poem celebrating the Battle of Maldon describes what happened next. The Vikings taunted the English, who could not cross the water to fight. Bertnoth, in a moment of prideful folly, agreed to let the Vikings cross the causeway when the tide turned so they could have a fair fight on the mainland. The Viking leader waited for the peak of high tide. Then, as the tide began to ebb, he moved his men across the now exposed causeway. His understanding of the local tidal current gave him a huge advantage. He knew that once his men were across, the ebbing tide would start to run fiercely. The current in the channel would become a swift, deep river. This meant that the English, if they tried to retreat back across the causeway, would be swept away. It also meant that any English reinforcements would be unable to cross to help their comrades. The Vikings had effectively used the tide to cut the English army off from any escape or support. The battle was a disaster for the Anglo-Saxons. Bertnoth was killed, and his army was defeated. The victory was a result of Viking ferocity, but it was made possible by a canny leader's practical understanding of coastal hydrodynamics. He read the rhythm of the local tide and used it to set a perfect trap. This was a secret of the waves that had nothing to do with open ocean navigation and everything to do with winning a battle on a foreign shore. Number 4, the world is built on patterns, not chaos. Magnus Barefoot was king of Norway in the late 11th century. He was a classic Viking king, spending most of his reign on expeditions in the west, solidifying Norse control over the Scottish Isles, the Isle of Man, and parts of Ireland. These were not voyages into the unknown like the Greenland or Vinland journeys. This was about controlling unknown sea kingdom. Success depended on speed, predictability, and the ability to move fleets of ships with precision. Magnus's navigators relied on a system that was less about discovery and more about repeatability. A steersman in Magnus's fleet, a man from the Orkneys named Einar, would not have had a paper chart. His chart was in his head. It was a mental map built on a series of rhumb lines. A rhumb line is a course sailed with a constant bearing. The method was simple. To get from Bergen in Norway to the Orkneys, you sailed due west. To get from the Orkneys to Dublin, you sailed out southwest. These were not abstract concepts, they were lived experiences passed down from one generation of sailors to the next. Einar's chart was a memorized list of instructions. Sail from Bergen with the noon sun on your stern quarter. Keep it there for 2 days. You will see Fair Isle. From Fair Isle, you can see the Orkneys. It was a set of visual and solar cues. This system relied on the understanding that the world operated in predictable patterns. The sun's path was a pattern. The prevailing winds were a pattern. The coastal landmarks were a pattern. A key part of this was a detailed knowledge of the coastline. Einar would have memorized hundreds of miles of coastline, not as a continuous line, but as a series of unique profiles. He knew the shape of a particular mountain, the location of a specific rock formation like the Old Man of Hoy, the entrance to a sheltered fjord. These were the waypoints on his mental map. He was connecting the dots between known points. This method also included time and speed. Einar could judge his ship's speed by watching bubbles or a piece of wood float past the hull. He knew that at a good sailing speed, it took about a day and a half to cross the open water between Shetland and the Faroe Islands. They measured distance in days of sailing, dager sigling. This was not a precise unit, but it was a practical one. It combined time and speed into a single intuitive measure. The entire system was a vast oral encyclopedia of geographic and environmental patterns. It was robust. If the sun was hidden, Einar could use the direction of the swell. If the swell was calm, he could use the wind. If the wind was variable, he could wait for a clear night and use the North Star. He was always cross-referencing different sets of patterns. This was not the heroic navigation of a lone explorer, it was the systematic, disciplined navigation of a professional, a man whose job was to move men and material reliably through a complex but ultimately understandable world. While he saw the world not as chaos, but as an intricate machine whose gears and levers he had learned to operate. Number 3. The sea leaves its mark on the land. In the late 9th century, a Viking named Thorir the Silent settled in Iceland. He was a farmer, not a sailor, but like all Icelanders, his life was tied to the sea. He chose to build his farm on a stretch of coast that seemed inhospitable to an outsider. It was a rocky, exposed shoreline. But Thorir had noticed something. He had spent weeks walking the coast before choosing his spot. He was looking at the debris left by the sea. He was reading the rack line. This is the line of seaweed, driftwood, and other flotsam left on the beach at the highest point of the high tide. By observing this line over time, he could learn a great deal about the local sea conditions. On one stretch of beach, the rack line was a thick, tangled mass of heavy kelp and large pieces of driftwood, including whole logs. This told him that this beach was exposed to the full force of the ocean. Winter storms must be ferocious here, capable of tearing up the deep kelp forests and throwing heavy logs high up the shore. This was not a safe place to keep a boat. A few miles away, in a small cove, the rack line was different. It was a thin, delicate line composed of smaller seaweeds, shells, and tiny bits of wood. There were no large logs. This told Thor that the cove was sheltered. The powerful ocean swells could not reach this spot. This was a safe place to launch and land a boat, even when the sea outside was rough. He also looked at the trees and vegetation near the coast. In the exposed areas, the trees were stunted and bent, their branches all growing away from the sea, a clear sign of the power of the prevailing salt-laden wind. They were natural weather vanes, recording the direction of the most powerful winds. In the sheltered cove, the trees grew straight and tall. This detailed observation of the land's interaction with the sea was a survival skill. It informed where to build a house, where to pasture sheep away from the salt spray, and most importantly, where to find a safe harbor. Viking sailors arriving on an unknown coast would use the same techniques. A quick look at the rack line and the coastal vegetation would give them an instant assessment of the local conditions. A thick rack line of heavy debris meant a dangerous, high-energy coastline. A thin line in a sheltered bay meant a safe anchorage. They were reading the history of the waves, written on the shore. The sea was constantly leaving clues about its own character, and the Vikings knew how to read them. Number 2. The air itself is a signpost. The winter of 1015 in Dublin was unusually harsh. The Norse Gaelic city was a bustling port, but the cold had put a damper on trade. Ivar, a seasoned captain of a trading nar, was anxious to set sail for the Isle of Man. His cargo of wool and hides was loaded, but the weather was unstable. Every morning he would stand on the quay, not looking at the sky, but feeling the air on his face. One morning the air felt different. For weeks it had been a damp, biting cold carried on a north wind, but this morning the wind had shifted to the southwest, and the air felt strangely mild and soft. For the middle of winter, it also felt heavy and humid. The sky was still clear, but Ivar knew this was a warning. He called it weather breeder air. It was a sign of a coming storm. He knew from a lifetime at sea that a warm, moist southwesterly wind in the middle of a cold winter was a classic precursor to a major Atlantic storm. The warm air mass, full of moisture from the south, was pushing in and would soon clash with the cold, dry air it was displacing. This clash would create a powerful storm system. He told his crew they would not be sailing. They grumbled. The sky was blue, the wind was fair, but Ivar was firm. He also looked at the smoke rising from the cooking fires in the city. For days, the smoke had risen straight up or drifted gently north in the cold, stable air. This morning, the smoke rose a short way and then was pushed over and flattened by the wind, barely clearing the rooftops. This told him that the wind was strong just above the surface, another sign of an approaching weather front. 2 days later, the storm hit. The wind howled from the southwest, driving a torrential, sleety rain. The ships in the harbor strained at their moorings. Any vessel caught at sea would have been in grave danger. Ivar's ship was safe. His decision, which looked overly cautious to his younger crew, had been based on a deep, intuitive understanding of meteorology. So he didn't have barometers or weather charts, but he could read the signs in the air itself. He knew that a ring around the moon at night caused by ice crystals and high-altitude cirrus clouds often preceded a warm front and rain by 24 to 48 hours. He knew that a red sky at sunset meant that the dry, stable air to the west was clear, and so the next day would likely be fair. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. He knew that a red sky in the morning meant that this clear weather had already passed, and a storm system to the west was now illuminating the clouds from behind. Red sky in morning, sailor's warning. These were not just rhymes, they were reliable rules of thumb, part of a vast body of weather lore built on centuries of careful observation of the patterns of the sky and the feel of the air. Number 1. Your own body is the finest instrument. The year is 860. A young man named Bjorn is on his first raid. The longship is cutting through the waves off the coast of Francia. The leader of the raid is a legend, a man known as Hastin, feared for his cunning and his almost supernatural ability to navigate. A fog has come down, thick and disorienting. The ship is moving slowly, the men at the oars. Bjorn feels lost, a knot of fear in his stomach. The world has shrunk to a few yards of gray water around the ship. Hastin is at the steering oar, a massive rudder-like plank. He is not looking at anything. His eyes are half closed. He seems almost to be sleeping. But Bjorn notices that Hastin's feet are bare, planted firmly on the deck. His grip on the steering oar is light. He is not fighting the sea, he is feeling it. Through the soles of his bare feet, Hastin can feel the subtle vibrations of the ship. He can feel the rhythm of the waves passing underneath. He can distinguish the short, quick shudder of a local wind chop from the long, deep heave of a groundswell. This groundswell, coming from the west, is his compass. He is steering by the feel of the waves. His entire body is an extension of the ship, a sensory organ receiving information directly from the ocean. With his face, he feels the wind. He can feel the slightest change in its direction and temperature. A cold puff of wind from a new direction might signal they are passing the mouth of a river. A dampness in the air might mean they are approaching a fog bank. His ears, tuned by years at sea, are listening to the sound of the wind in the rigging, the creak of the timbers, the gurgle of water along the hull. Each sound tells him something about their speed and the state of the sea. This is the ultimate secret, the one that underpins all the others. The Vikings' greatest navigational tool was their own body. They had not dulled their senses with technology. They lived in a state of constant, heightened awareness of their environment. They could smell the land, hear the waves on a distant shore, feel the direction of the swell through the soles of their feet, and read the coming weather and the feel of the air on their skin. Their knowledge was not academic, stored in books. It was somatic, stored in their muscles and nerves. It was a deep physical intelligence. Hastin suddenly opens his eyes. "Hard to port," he commands. The oarsmen on the right dig in. The ship turns sharply. A moment later, the dark, jagged shape of a rock looms out of the fog, passing harmlessly by their starboard side. Bjorn stares, his heart pounding. How did he know? Hastin had likely heard the way the waves sounded as they broke against the unseen rock, a subtle echo that his experienced ears could pick out from the general noise of the sea. He had navigated them through a blind channel using senses that Bjorn was only just beginning to realize he had. The lost secrets were not in magical stones or ancient maps. They were in the human body's incredible ability to read the world, a skill that the Vikings had honed to a level we can barely comprehend.